Hey, Year 12. Your work this week is about researching how powerful the modern Prime Minister is. To do that, the first piece of work is to look at an article by Peter Riddell about Tony Blair, Prime Minister or President. Now, this article is pretty good in the sense that it raises issues about Blair. It's written in 2006, looking at his time as Prime Minister, but it also lays down a few of the things that we want to consider when we're looking at Prime Ministers moving forward. Your job will be to read the article and then to use a form to show off your knowledge. Okay, so this video should give you a little bit of help in understanding what the article is getting at. So when Riddell starts, he's really talking about where does this discussion come from? Does Cabinet have power? Does Prime Minister have power? Really emerged as a discussion really in the 1960s with Crossman and Mackintosh, both of whom had perceptions that perhaps the Prime Minister was increasingly more relevant in terms of decision making. And this aspect of centralised system is where Riddell puts forward those particular perspectives. When he looks at In the Spotlight, he's actually saying now that what we're seeing is how the Prime Minister has really enhanced their role in terms of the perception of them being at the centre of government and also almost the head of state. Riddell looks to two things. One, foreign policy, and the role of the Prime Minister as almost the chief diplomat of the country, being a main focus at summits, perhaps the European Union, G8, those type of things, where the Prime Minister is clearly the focus of what the nation is doing. Secondly, Riddell talks about the role of the media and how over time from the 1970s onwards, what we're seeing is the media much more interested in the role of the Prime Minister in terms of the decision making that goes on in government. These things together, when you consider Prime Ministers such as Blair, Thatcher, even Churchill going back to the 1950s, have given the impression that the Prime Minister is almost presidential, beyond their cabinet, beyond the government, in making decisions for the country. However, Riddell is also quick to look at the varying factors which can influence the power of the Prime Minister. Issues such as parliamentary majority size, their relationship with their cabinet, and other crises that may occur around the Prime Minister at the time, which can actually influence the strength of the Prime Minister, in sometimes enhancing it, but at other times reducing it. Then Riddell goes on to talk about how Blair approached his time in his office. What's interesting about Blair is he took office in 1997, 18 years after any Labour minister had actually been in government, and he didn't have any experience at all. He came with some preconceptions. He remembered how the Labour government was in the late 1970s, and he was concerned about the image that was put across by Callaghan during the IMF crisis and later, about how he tried to have many cabinet meetings to make decisions. Blair didn't want that. He wanted a more authoritative government. He wanted a clearer message coming out for the government, and that's how he designed his particular style of government and core executive. The way in which he centralised power around number 10, his use of bilateral meetings as a means of making decisions with different ministers. And I think that's important when you're considering his approach. Are you going to have evidence of how he used special advisors to actually shape his policy? These things are aspects that we can then look at different Prime Ministers moving on from there. Riddell also then looks at the role that Cabinet played in Blair's government, from the initial stages when they seemed to be sidelined, and you know the discussion that we've had in regards to Cook and Short about their concerns in regards to how Blair approached the Iraq War. But Riddell then looks at the period after the Iraq War and the way in which Blair became, I suppose, more seeking of cabinet support as his ministers grew more experienced, and the fact that he wanted to use cabinet committees to focus on particular issues that he had to do with antisocial behaviour, health or education, the areas that he wanted to make sure were driven forward and he didn't rely purely on his departments to do. Finally, what Riddell does is he looks at how Blair controlled or didn't control Parliament. The perception is that Blair was almost dismissive of Parliament. His voting record sort of reflects that, the way in which he changed things, such as Prime Minister's questions. But that's not to ignore the rebellious nature of his own party and the rebellions he had to face over tuition fees and foundation hospitals. If you don't know what foundation hospitals are, they were the way in which, for example, the Durham Hospital was built. not using taxpayers' money, but actually private money as a means of actually creating the hospitals on a quicker basis, and not necessarily impacting upon the taxpayer as such. This brought great problems for some parts of his political party. So he had problems with the rebellions there. He also had difficulties because he changed the House of Lords. He got rid of the hereditary peers, which made them feel more legitimate and more willing to challenge the Labour government after that point. So when we discuss whether or not Blair controlled Parliament, there are definitely arguments on both sides. So your job now is to read the article by Riddell and then go and try the form to show off your knowledge. That'll be the basis by which we'll have our next week's seminar. Good luck.